This is the Roller Coaster Podcast, and I'm your host, Lucy Q. Life is a wild ride. It has twists and turns. It's scary, exciting, and downright fun. So throw your head back, arms in the air, and come along with me for the ride.
Life is like a roller coaster, baby, baby. I wanna ride.
Episode 200 of the roller coaster will soon be here, and this is your chance to be part of the fun. I'm going to be recording this episode with coaches and listeners just like you. If you want to be part of the fun, head over to nectargrowth.com. Sign up for free and RSVP for the November 18th event. All of the details will be under the events tab. I can't wait to see you there. What are you waiting for? Come join us. You know you're worth it. Regardless of what stage of life you're at, chances are you've encountered a situation where you've been asked to step up as a leader. Now, a good leader can initiate action, offer guidance, and inspire. So, is leadership a skill or is it a natural born talent? Joining me today is Emily Sander of Next Level Coaching and author of Hacking Executive Leadership to chat about how we can level up our leadership. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Lucy. Good to be with you.
It's great to have you here. I think the topic of leadership is always so interesting. And I think we've seen a lot of different styles of leadership over the past 18 months. And we've seen some really good examples of how leadership can inspire us, but we've also seen how leadership can confuse and create chaos. So, what sort of led you onto the path of diving into leadership?
Yeah, the earliest memories I have of it are actually from my dad. He's a history buff. And so he studies, the Roman emperors and, World War II and Civil War. So I grew up with those books and stories around me. And just hearing about the different kinds of leaders and what a difference they can make. And certainly, in a war situation, those can be pretty impactful. So, hopefully none of us have life or death kind of situations going on. But, that was my first, oh my gosh, yes, charging, a beachhead for freedom or, Little Round Top. I remember learning about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in the Battle of Gettysburg and learning about the bayonet charge. So those are the first memories that pop up. And then both my parents were in the business world. And so they were just leaders themselves. So I had a living, breathing example of two great leaders in the business setting. And so without even kind of knowing I was getting a lesson per se, I was getting a lesson every day in leadership. So, from there, I went into business myself, and we can talk about that. But I stepped into different leadership positions. Sometimes I was thrust into them. So I got, pushed off the deep end with ankle weights a few times, but sink or swim situations. So different points of that. But I love leadership. I love helping people define what it is for them to be a good leader, because that's an individual thing. And what makes you a good leader might not work for someone else. So I kind of love delving into all of that and unpacking that for people.
So let's go back to, and I know what makes a good leader, it can depend on the circumstances, but overall, are there some general traits as to what makes a good leader?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2020, you kind of mentioned the last 18 months. So that was a year where leaders had to adapt quite a lot. And no one could have predicted this global pandemic. So something I saw that really served teams and leaders well was transparency. So being transparent. And even if the answer is, I don't know, and you have to stand up in front of your entire company and groups of people, and they have really hard questions about their job and their families, and you have to say, I don't know, because that's the honest answer. So I saw a lot of people step up and do that. I saw a lot of people do the opposite and panic, and that has a different effect, or a lot of people kind of jump to one side or the other and kind of shout as loud as they can about something. So, I think transparency in any situation is a good thing. Obviously, there's been lots written and talked about building up trust, but without trust, it's really hard to get anywhere in any sort of relationship. So I would say, figure out what makes that person tick, figure out what's motivating them or what this job means to them at that moment in time, and then, have your interaction or build your relationship up from there.
You touched on two very important aspects of leadership: transparency and trust. And I think those really go hand in hand. And I think it's one of the things, at least here in Canada, that I felt that we've been failed at. Is I really wish that our country's leaders would just say, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would trust them more than keep getting in front of us and saying, we know everything, this is the way it is.
Yeah.
And then 2 days later, they're giving a completely different story. And you're like, well, I trusted you then. I don't trust you now. It's kind of
wish trust you now.
Yeah. And after 18 months of this, you're like, I don't believe anything that's coming out of your mouth. We're actually in the middle of a federal election. So the question of leadership is at the forefront of Canadians. Probably by the time this airs, the election's going to be over with, and we're going to have a new system to be dealing with, whatever that looks like. But, when it comes to leadership and, the transparency and being truthful, I think with that also comes vulnerability. So when you're talking about leadership, is there a time and a place for vulnerability? Or is it something that you need to embrace so that you can be transparent and trustworthy?
Yeah, I think you touched on something really big, which is situational leadership. So different situations call for you to kind of not become someone else. That sounds a little bit weird, but kind of, be your best self in a different situation. So, standing up in front of people saying, I don't know, when that can be a very unpopular answer, you have to be vulnerable and allow yourself to go up there and say, this is me being honest, and this is me being authentic and me being vulnerable. And, knowing that it can also engender trust in that process as well. So there are times where, you think of a leader as like a big booming leader who has all the answers, who makes the really emotional and enthusiastic speech. And that is, a certain situation, and that situation, you might be called to do that. But there's other times where you as a leader, the most powerful thing you can do is sit in a room and listen to people and not say anything. So there's a whole bunch of situations where, hey, I'm going to sit in a room, listen to you, show you that I'm actually paying attention to what you're saying and being engaged, but it's maybe asking one or two questions to make sure you're hearing that correctly, not necessarily having the right answer. So a lot of my kind of executive folks that I work with are always afraid that I have to have the answer. Everyone's looking at me, Emily, for the answer. And sometimes it's about taking that pressure off of yourself and saying, hey, me just being here and listening to them and hearing the issues that are important to them and hearing their perspective and what this means for them is really, really important. That actually goes a long way. And actually asking the most relevant, salient question is going to be most impactful in that situation versus I have to have the right answer. So I'm just going to say something to say something.
Yeah. And one of the major lessons I learned about leadership is, and I want to say it came from the book Good to Great. And it was basically a great leader doesn't have all the answers. They just surround themselves with the right people.
Yep. Yeah. I love that because, a good leader, it doesn't have to be their way. So they're managing to an outcome or to a result. And if they find people who can do it better, or they find people who can fill the gap of their quote unquote weakness, then that's a strong leader. So a strong leader doesn't go, hey, I want yes men or yes women all around me that just say, yes, 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 you're the greatest thing ever. And your ideas are the best. They want ones that challenge them and ask them the right questions and bring different creative solutions to that. So yeah, I love that. And then get out of their way. So I've had people on my team where I'm like, oh my goodness, my job was to recruit and hire the right person. I clearly did that. Now my job is to get out of your way and let you do a good job.
And leaders, it's easy to spot the leaders in government, in our communities, in, as the leaders that you first learned about in history. It's easy to spot those leaders. But I think people don't give enough value to the everyday leader. Every parent is a leader in their own home. Every Cub Scout leader is a leader. Every teacher is a leader.
Oh, yeah.
And I think people don't really look at it from that point of view. So how do we start to establish what our baseline for leadership is, and then what steps we need to take to level up?
Yeah, well, I think just on that point, so even in one single interaction, you can be a leader. So if you're on the bus or public transportation, and you give up your seat for someone who needs the seat more than you, and then another person does that, then you've just led that group of people in that one interaction. So you've become a leader. And certainly, leaders in your home and in your community. So yeah, leaders don't have to be kind of these big faces on monuments or statues or anything like that. And to your point, I think it is just keeping that in mind and waking up every day saying, hey, I have the intention or the intent of being a good leader in all of the big things and big decisions I'm doing today, and all of the medium to small things or interactions that I'm going to have today. And if you set yourself up for that at the beginning, you will be surprised at how many opportunities present themselves throughout the day. And I have found, hey, it's like saying, look for red cars. Well, okay, if you say, look for red cars, more red cars are going to appear. And you're like, oh my goodness, they must have manufactured more red cars. And of course, that's not the case. You just see more of them. So I think setting that intent and reminding yourself throughout the day, like, hey, here's the type of person that I want to be, and here's how I want to show up. And so I'm going to go out and do these things.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I'd never thought of it like that we're all leaders of our own life. We're like the CEO of us.
Yeah.
And, I sort of think about, a simple transaction of, going through the drive-through and getting your morning tea or coffee. How you relate to that person that's serving you is no different than how a leader in a business should be interacting with their team.
Absolutely. So you hit on another big one, which is being authentic. So that leader going through the drive-through should show up as the same person as when they're making, a pitch to a VC or PE firm or all company meeting. So are they showing up in the same way? Or, do you act one way when you're at the office and then you go home and act an entirely different way? Obviously, you're in a different setting with different people, but you know what I mean. Basically, are you changing who you are and your values and what you're about and how you interact with people? Or are you just, I'm Emily wherever I go, you're Lucy wherever you go?
And it's funny because I can remember working with men in the past, because traditionally there were more men in leadership. But I can remember working with men who around the office, they'd be walking around, pounding their own chest, I'm good, I'm great. And then there'd be in a situation where their spouses would be involved. And you're like, whoa, wait a second. You do not rule the roost at home at all.
Yeah. That's funny. I had an office next to a sales leader, and he was, kind of what you think of when you think of a sales leader, very gregarious and emotive and out there and dressed flashy. But I would overhear some of the calls home and he was very much, yes, ma'am. Okay, yes, I'll pick them up. I was like, okay, so you're taking orders at home, but it's kind of funny.
Yeah, you can see how some people are overcompensating leadership if they don't have it in one place, they're trying to overcompensate it in the workplace. So
Exactly.
it's always interesting when you see that side of things. And I think that's just an important lesson that, you know, you can't always judge where somebody's coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, you know, people can feel when you're being authentic and also when you're genuinely interested in them. So, you've probably heard there's lots of political leaders, Bill Clinton was one in the US where everyone said, if you were one on one with Bill Clinton, he could make you feel like the most important person in the room. And that is a skill and that is a gift. And I think leaders who have that genuine capacity to actually, focus in on the person they're talking to and trying to figure out what's important to them is really key. So I remember I was working at a job a few years ago, and I was in the kitchen getting coffee, and our CEO walked over, and I knew he had a million things on his mind, really big strategic things, and he stopped and he said, "Emily, how are you and how's your team doing?" And my mind was like blown. I was like, "Oh my gosh, like Todd, you're asking about me? Like you have more important things to be worrying about." But he stopped, he put his cup down, and he faced me and really wanted to hear what I had to say. It wasn't kind of like, "Hey, how are you doing? Thanks, goodbye." And just those little interactions and knowing that someone actually wants to hear how you are doing and how your team is doing and what's going on for you is huge. So don't discount those quote unquote little things, especially if you're in a leadership position. Those go a long way.
And those simple things are also easily translated into your life, your community. It's, whether it's checking in with a neighbor, hey, how's it going? Do you
Yeah,
need anything? It's all these little things that can make a massive difference.
yeah. And I will say, good leaders will pay attention to those little things with respect to their peers and the members of their team. So I remember, long story short, I was doing something for someone else and I was like, no one can see this and I don't need to be public about it, but it's just the right thing to do. And my boss, she was like, Emily, I've seen you for the past year do this thing and I really want to recognize you and reward you. I was like, I didn't even know that you were paying attention to that level. I didn't even know that you were doing that. But the fact that she both took note of that and then eventually told me like, hey, I was watching you do this, and that type of person and that type of character is what we need at our next level of leadership at this company was huge. So those little things make a difference, and you never, not to do it for who's watching or not, but you never know who's watching. And if you are a leader or if you are a parent or if you are in a position of influence in your community, keep your eye out for those type of things, because people may be doing stuff that you're not even aware of. That's really great and should be kind of publicly recognized, and at the very least kind of mental note like, hey, Lucy's doing that great thing over there.
Yeah, and it's about catching people doing things good, because often you don't hear from leadership, whether it's in a business setting or in a community or home setting. A lot of the times you don't hear from leadership unless you've done something wrong.
Yeah.
So it's so important to catch people doing something right. I think you've somewhere along the line, I heard a formula of, sort of 3-1, but it should probably be more like 10-1.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a really great point. I know so many managers, especially first time managers, who think it's their job to catch people making a mistake and be like, I gotcha. And in reality, it's equally, if not more important to say, hey, you really do a nice job when you de-escalate, that customer who's upset, or, hey, I really liked how you helped train the new hire. He was having trouble with that and you jumped right in and just, tag team that call with him. So just things like that. And that can be extrapolated to other areas of life. But I think, again, setting that intention and putting that lens on to where it's like, hey, I'm going to look for good things. And lo and behold, you will see more good things and more positive things if you have that lens on.
Definitely. Now, in your book, what are some of the topics that you hit on in your book?
Yeah, so we kind of hit on a few of them. So one is that I have a metaphor or analogy of a contact lens, and the analogy, the belief set that you hold. So we all are looking at life and events in life and experiencing life through a set of, we all hold them. And it's almost like a contact lens, because sometimes you forget that they're on, or you don't know that they're on. So an example, just a quick example of a hidden belief you might have from childhood, you could have inherited that. Literally, it's grandfathered in from the family you were raised in, or the place you grew up, et cetera, and you might not know that's there. So the example is, hey, if you say, don't talk to strangers to a little kid who's about to walk to school for the first time, that might be sound advice. If you give that same set of instructions to the adult version of that person when they're about to walk into a networking conference for business, that would sound pretty odd. So in the same way, do you have any belief sets that you're holding on to that you're not aware of and actually aren't serving you well now? And so those ones can be set aside, and then you can pick up new ones. So just something to look at. The takeaway there would be, let me take inventory of the lens that everything I see and everything I take in is being filtered through.
And what would be some of those beliefs that we have sort of, I know you gave the one of the stranger, but what would be sort of one that you've encountered a lot in the business setting?
Yeah, so a common one is team meetings. So going into a team meeting and saying to yourself, I'm a bad speaker, or I don't ask good questions, or everyone thinks I'm stupid in this meeting. So if that's your belief set and everything that you see and hear is going through that filter, then you're going to experience that meeting one way. If instead you flip out your contacts and put in new ones and say, I am a good speaker, I bring a lot of value to this conversation, and I ask insightful questions, and I actually have information that the other team members don't. So I provide a lot of value in that way, a lot of unique value. That's going to make you look at things differently and say, oh, there's an opportunity right there for me to jump in and add some value, and it'll make you act differently. So kind of the beliefs go to how we feel, which goes to how we act. That's the chain link there.
And that, and flipping a switch, we can also do that as a leader in how we see situations, and then, use it to question ourselves if we are showing up as our best in a situation. And I recently was, in a business setting, there was somebody that was working with me, and they were just not meeting expectation. And, my first thought was, okay, this is not working. We just got to cut this loose and then move on. And I sort of stopped and I really thought about it. And I'm like, okay, but was I the best that I could be? Did I do everything that I could to make sure this person was successful? And it's really sort of, it's like you said about taking the lenses off and looking at things that, hey, wait a second, maybe this isn't about them. Maybe this is about me. How can I show up differently to create the success in the environment that we're looking for?
Yeah, well, when you take responsibility for that, you actually empower yourself. So instead of, hey, it's everyone else's, fault, or I'm assigning blame, which is very external. And okay, if it's everyone else's fault, things just happen to me. That's kind of it can lead toward a victim mentality. Whereas like, hey, no, like let me take responsibility for the part that I played in this, if any, and that's the part that I can control. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. And another example that came up as you were talking is most people, change is bad. So if like, oh my gosh, something uncertain has happened, something changed and I didn't expect that, they automatically slap a negative label on that. When in reality, change is neutral. So change in and of itself is a neutral thing. And people go, no, like Emily, like if something uncertain happens, like I go into fight or flight mode, I have to have a plan. This is really uneasy. And I go, okay, well, if I told you that you just won $1 million, that would be a change. How do you feel? I'm like, oh, well, I feel pretty good about that one. So, change in and of itself isn't negative. It's a label that a lot of people will automatically slap on. So it might be something where you have kind of a different filter, a different kind of way to catch it and say, change is neutral. Let me see how this unfolds. Maybe it'll lead to something that I don't particularly care for, but maybe it'll be a stepping stone to something I didn't expect that's positive. Or maybe this uncertain thing will actually be a catalyst for, a new chapter in my life that I didn't expect, but it's actually better than what I've been going through.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, in your book, you mention something called the Art of the Swizzle.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
Yeah, so swizzle is a word I made up. I was trying to think of what I was trying to say. I blurted it out. And basically it means taking the best components of multiple areas and combining them to make a new relevant thing. So let me give you a quick example. Let's say you have to prepare a slideshow, so a PowerPoint presentation, and you have 3 previous decks that you've done for different audiences. And so if you take a couple of slides from deck 1, a couple of slides from deck 2 and 3, and then you reorder them, maybe adjust some of the content, make the formatting all consistent, and you have a new deck. You've basically swizzled that new deck. So you've taken the best components of different areas and made this brand new thing that's relevant and most useful. And if you expand that concept, one example I give in the book is I was listening to a podcast and they were interviewing Floyd Mayweather, who's a champion boxer. I know nothing about boxing and you don't want to see me box, but it was an interesting interview. And they were asking him, like, what makes you so good? Is it like how fast your hands are? Is it your training program? Is it your diet? And finally he said, it's how adaptable I am. I adapt the best. I adapt to each opponent. I adapt to each round I'm in. I adapt to each punch that's thrown at me. I am the best at that. And that's what makes me a champion boxer. And I was like, oh my gosh. Okay. So again, not a boxer, but I can take that concept and apply it over in business and over in life and everything. Being adaptable is a trait that I think is really transferable. So I can swizzle that and say, okay, how am I showing up in my team meetings on Monday versus on Thursday? Do I need to change up what I'm talking about? Do I need to change up how I'm showing up to these different audiences? Am I adapting well? And same thing with what we talked about with COVID and all the rest, how are you adapting to change?
That makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense. I like that. Swizzle.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny because I blurted it out and then people started picking it up and they would change it to like the swizz and like the swizzlage. And I heard it in a board meeting once. My colleague was like, yeah, we can definitely swizzle something up for you. And I was like, yes, like that's happening. Yes.
You created a new word. Now, Emily, I know people are listening and they're going to want to grab a copy of your book. Where can they do that?
Yeah, so Hacking Executive Leadership is on Amazon. It's wherever books are sold. I also have an Audible version. So I know people are busy and sometimes they like to listen to it in the background, but you can pick it up on Amazon or Audible.
Well, if you're listening and you're looking at grabbing a copy of Emily's book, make sure you check out the show notes. I'm going to have all of her links in there. And Emily, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Lizzie.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Roller Coaster Podcast. Want to chat or share your ideas about today's show? Pop me an email at hello@therollercoasterpodcast.com. Don't forget to connect with me on Facebook and Instagram at The Roller Coaster Podcast. Our theme song, Roller Coaster, was performed by The Lucky Setback. Audio editing by the one and only Jeff Quigley of Quigley Creative.
Life is like a roller coaster, baby, baby. I wanna ride, 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 ride. Life is like a roller coaster, baby, baby. I wanna ride, 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 ride. Roller coaster. Ride, ride. Roller coaster.